Let me first of all introduce Jonathan Coppell, who is Commissioner with the Productivity Commission, and today you brought out your report, didn't you? A fantastic report on trade. What was the exact title?
Rising Protectionism, Challenges, Threats and Opportunities.
We were, at one point, Jonathan told me that he really didn't think he could come today because the report wasn't due out till tomorrow. I did put a bit of pressure on him to bring the report out today so that he could still be here, and I'm glad to say that the pressure or whatever did work. So Jonathan has been managing this major research exercise on the impacts on Australia of possible international shifts in trade policy towards a more protectionist stance and implications for our economy and our trade policy. So thank you very much for coming along. We're very pleased.
Thank you, Peter.
Negotiate through this.
You have to click that one. No. That's it. So I am going to talk about the report from the Productivity Commission, which did come out earlier today. It's actually titled Rising Protectionism, Challenges, Threats and Opportunities for Australia. And what I'll do is give a little bit of motivation for why the Productivity Commission initiated this research project. Then I'm going to go through the analysis of what rising protectionism may mean under a set of different scenarios for the Australian economy and to a certain extent other economies, and then draw out some of the implications that this has for trade policy and foreign investment policy. So let me start with the motivation. Trump is always a great motivator, and this is one of many examples I could have used to indicate that at least the sentiment towards protectionism has been rising. I think it also coincides with a number of people manifesting scepticism about the benefits of trade and concerned about some of the impacts that more open markets may be having, particularly on labour markets. These are not new. Typically, protectionism sentiment does escalate during periods of sluggish growth and sluggish income growth. And this has been something which has been evident post the GFC, and I'm talking now internationally, so it's particularly among some of other advanced economies and in particular the United States. But it's not just the United States, it's not a US phenomenon alone. A number of prospective EU leaders also indicated a stance more towards closing markets than continuing the pursuit of liberalisation that has been the modus operandum since, with ups and downs, since the end of the Second World War. At the same time, there have been a number of developments in international trade that I think are also relevant, and some of them are connected. We have many more bilateral trade agreements globally. Those trade agreements have become much more comprehensive, much more complex, and are encroaching into areas that do have consequences for national sovereignty. Global value chains have also risen in importance, a little less so in Australia than a number of other economies. And the third point that has differed over recent years is that the progress on multilateral negotiations for trade is essentially at a standstill or dead. And Australia is not immune from this protectionist sentiment. If you look at surveys of community views on particular matters, and there is a survey that looks at globalisation, and only 50% of Australians would agree that globalisation has been a force for good. And we have a citation here from Pauline Hanson. We don't mention this specifically in the report, but it's also indicative of a political push among some towards questioning the benefits that have come from the opening of economies to trade and investment. And it's not just sentiment or an expectation that this may change in the past. The WTO, together with the OECD and UNCTAD, have been monitoring among G20 countries trade restrictive measures, and they have quadrupled over the period since they started monitoring. They now represent, in their estimates, about 5% of global trade. So a lot of these things are quite small, but they also do include tariff increases, I'm assuming from applied rates to bound rates or closer towards bound rates. And the other point to make is that the degree of trade relative to output, after increasing steadily for the last 4 or 5 decades, has reached a plateau and is relative to GDP steady, or some would say on a declining path. So this is the situation that we find ourselves in. We would characterise that as global protectionism sentiment as one that's on the rise. There are clear and definitive risks that this will escalate, and it raises questions about what that would mean if it were to eventuate for Australia, and how Australian policymakers should respond. And it's those questions that I will then get that's those questions that I will address through the analysis that we've done at the Productivity Commission. What have we done? Well, specifically, we've looked at a set of stylised scenarios that we've modelled using GTAP, or a version of GTAP, which is a global CGE trade model. 4 particular sets of scenarios. The first is really just looking at a situation where trade barriers rise vis-a-vis the United States, Mexico and China. We take at face value what was said during the presidential campaign, and we look at what the impact of that would be on Australia and other countries. We look at border adjustments, or at least the trade part of the border adjustments that are proposed as part of the US tax reform package. I won't talk about them further than that today. And then we look at what might eventuate if this trend were to escalate through reprisals in terms of a tit-for-tat response that leads to a form of global contagion, and then responses that can mitigate some of the adverse effects that would have on the Australian economy. And it's on that analysis that we then pull together some of the implications for policy. So here again, a couple more quotes from Trump. I can't resist. As I said, we take those at face value in terms of the scenarios. They are extreme, but they are designed to really illustrate the nature of some of the impacts. And I think, given this sentiment, it's very difficult to argue that the status quo will be maintained going forward. You could make a legitimate case that there will be modifications, maybe through more intense use of countervailing duties and anti-dumping duties, or you could also make a legitimate case that something more transformational is happening. So there he is again. The first set of scenarios looking at a 45% tariff on Chinese imports into the United States and a 35% tariff on Mexican imports into the United States, and both China and Mexico retaliating in kind. What does that do? Well, obviously it makes a very substantial, very substantial increase in the applied tariff rate. In the case of Mexico, because of NAFTA, it's essentially going from 0 to 35%. In the case of China, it's still, or even more so, a substantial increase. If you're a trade person, you will say, well, this breaches trade rules. We know, and I'm sure President Trump knows, but he's also said that he would ignore those rules if they weren't in the interests of the United States. So again, these are very much stylised scenarios. We're taking them at face value. They're quite substantial. The purpose is really to get a sense of what they may mean for the effects on trade and on measures like GDP and broader measures of living standards. Well, despite that very substantial increase in tariffs on China and Mexico, the story is essentially that trade gets redirected and that means the overall level of trade will be lower, but not substantially lower as you would think, given the order of magnitude of tariff increases. The one economy that really does get hit by such a policy, as you can see on the slide, is Mexico. This is linked to the fact that 80% plus of Mexican exports goes to the United States. It's also, I think, linked to the closeness of the supply chains between the United States and Mexico. Other countries like China are obviously affected, and so is the United States. For Australia, essentially, it's unchanged. Now, GTAP is a general equilibrium model. It looks at one equilibrium to another equilibrium. It doesn't look at in our version, it doesn't look at the dynamics from one equilibrium to another. I would stress that for a change of that order of magnitude, the disruption to trade before the dust settles would be substantial. And it's particularly so now that value chains are such a prominent, cross-border value chains are such a prominent mode of manufacturing. One of the motivations that's been put forward for such tariffs is to address the bilateral trade deficit between the United States and China. And this reminds me of the first time I presented at the Economic Society of Australia, which was 30 years ago, first and only time, talking about the Treasury's national income forecasting model for the current account. And nowhere in that model would be tariffs or export subsidies, and the reason is they don't have a bearing on the trade balance of Australia or any other country. And you can see that in this slide here. The US trade deficit overall is unaffected by this scenario. For sure, the bilateral deficit with China and Mexico is reduced, but because of this trade rediversion, you'll see the deficit in other countries rises. So trade protection won't have the effect on bilateral trade deficits that is sometimes purported. So that's the bilateral story. If we moved in that direction, there could be pressure for tit for tat, and essentially the report has a doomsday scenario or an Armageddon scenario, and this is it. It's global contagion. And we've approximated this by applying 15 percentage point increase in tariff rates across the board, across all countries. That is really extreme. That would be akin to essentially repeating the level of trade protection that existed in the 1930s. And again, it's to illustrate the sad state of the world that we possibly will find ourselves in, and to understand some of the nature of the changes that would take place in such a scenario. This slide gives you an idea of what that would mean given existing average applied tariff rates. So some countries, it'll mean quite a significant level that's indicated by the blue bars. Those countries that have very low existing applied tariffs, it'll be a bit lower. But again, overall, very substantial increases. It's a bit rhetorical, but one way of presenting in a few words what that would mean would be akin to a global recession, and that's indicated by the bar on the right-hand side. We calculate that GDP globally would be 2.9 percentage points lower than would be otherwise. Again, Mexico gets hit harder than most other economies that we show here, but across the board there are losses. For Australia, the GDP number is, as you can see there. We've also calculated a number of other metrics looking at job losses. They would be in the order of 100,000. There's also job creation, but the losses from particular sectors that are hard hit would be in the order of 100,000. 5% of Australian capital stock would be essentially mothballed, and that's akin to about half of the increase in mining investment that we've seen in Australia over the last 10 years. And again, these are once the dust has settled. The disruption to existing trading relationships is not picked up, but would be, to say the least, substantial. We've also looked at what this means for Australian living standards, and this is a part of the report which I think is new relative to earlier studies by the Commission, at least, looking at questions of global trade. And we ask what it means for the average Australian household, and also across the distribution of Australian households. I won't go into the technicalities of how we do that, but I'll present some of the high-level results. So a global contagion for Australia would correspond to a decrease in the average Australian household income of the order of $1,600 a year. And as you can see in this slide, that is across the whole distribution, but that is not evenly distributed. So in our scenario, we have close to 4/5 of households that would be worse off, but that implies also that there's 1/5 that could potentially benefit from this global recession or global Armageddon of higher trade barriers. And I'm sure you're all saying to yourself, how is that possible? So let me try and explain with this very colourful graph. Essentially, we look at real income. There are two sides of the ledger, what you earn and what you spend, and particularly the prices of the goods on which you spend. And in this scenario, both income and prices of consumption goods are falling. Now, if you're in the situation where your income is falling faster than the price of your consumption bundle, you can't consume as much, so you will be one of those 79% that is worse off. But if the price of your consumption bundle falls faster than your income, you achieve a real gain, and that's essentially what's happening underlying these calculations. So we have some winners and we have some losers. Certainly the winners would be in a position to easily compensate those that are losers. But I think one of the messages that comes out of this analysis is that disruption of this sort has winners and losers. And I think in the past it's often been assumed that the winners will make this sort of scenario, or the reverse of this scenario, liberalisation, better overall, and that's definitely the case. But it also complicates the case for pursuing a policy of market liberalisation. And I'll come back to that at a later point in time. The other point that I'd like to make in this graph is that typically those that would be among that 21% are in the lowest and the second lowest decile. And this is because many of those households are essentially earning income from a government benefit, which is staying fixed, but the prices of the goods that they're consuming because of the contraction in overall demand are falling. So that's sort of the mechanic that lies behind that particular pattern that you see there. So that's the doomsday scenario. So what would happen then if Australia towed the line and resisted global contagion? And what would happen if we went further and at least pursued with like-minded countries an agreement that further liberalises international trade? And that's what this set of scenarios looks at. And I'll skip that graph and come to a slide that summarises what we did and the results in terms of the impact on GDP vis-a-vis baseline and purchasing power. So on the far left-hand side, you see the global contagion, same numbers, minus 1.1, 1.8. Then we look at the same scenario without Australia applying a 15 percentage point increase. And so the impacts there on purchasing power correspondingly less. They're particularly less for GDP, and that's picking up some of the price effects that occur with global contagion. The third, or the middle bar, is the RCEP region, used for illustrative purposes, also towing the line and not applying a 15 percentage point increase in tariffs. And there you can again see that the impacts would be moderated. Then we look at the same scenario, but RCEP countries start to address some of the non-tariff barriers that have been identified. And in the final scenario, both non-tariff barriers and remaining tariffs within the RCEP countries are reduced, and that you can see in the final bar there. So there's quite a variation across that suite of scenarios. The point is that holding the line is a valid response strategy, but you can do better if you're able to pursue that strategy with other like-minded countries. So, do I have time?
Another 5 minutes.
Yep. Okay, let's just briefly then wrap up with some of the implications for policy. In a world of rising protectionist pressure, what sort of policy approaches should Australia adopt? Well, as the analysis has illustrated, the worst response for Australia to global protectionism would be to increase trade barriers. But we also think that it would be a mistake to dismiss this sentiment of discontent. A lot of it is attributing trade, in my view, wrongly. I think a lot of the disruption is coming more from pressures associated with technological innovations. Make the point that most of the barriers in Australia to trade, which were reduced, mostly took place more than 2 decades ago. So you could safely argue that adjustment to that has been introduced. But even where people do support free trade, there are some legitimate concerns about particular trade agreements, and I mentioned the nature of bilateral agreements becoming much more comprehensive and getting into areas of domestic policy. So what does that mean for a policy response? The report, in answer to that, essentially sets out a 3-pronged strategy. One is to work to improve the existing rules for international trade and better trade and investment policy. The second focuses on what we call companion policies that facilitate adjustment to structural change in a broader sense, and also a more inclusive distribution of the benefits from trade. And the third gets at the role that can be played by communication of the case for more open markets. And I'll say a little bit about each of those. So first up, trade and investment policies. The report argues that there's still substantial scope for work towards freer markets. Australia's levels of protection are relatively high in Australia in comparison with other developed countries. 2 slides sort of illustrating that point. Similar picture for FDI. And we also argue that there's no reason why Australia couldn't act unilaterally to bring down some of these barriers, particularly when you're talking about non-tariff barriers, because the benefits essentially flow to Australian households and businesses and would be widely distributed among households and businesses. So the report identifies 3 specific options. We look at extending concessions and preferential agreements to all trade partners, essentially extending most favoured nation principle, addressing the many non-tariff measures that add to the cost of doing business across borders. And we also have a few things to say about making FDI approval processes more consistent, transparent and predictable, while at the same time preserving Australia's vital national security interests. So we think there are areas that can improve on Australia's trade and investment policy. But acting unilaterally is something that's easy to convince a room full of economists. The political pressure in a scenario where there is rising protectionism globally would be such that the pressure to follow suit would be quite intense. And this is part of the motivation for thinking about a strategy to resist or to counter those protectionist pressures. And the first prong of that is to strengthen the existing trade rules. And again, we think there's scope to do that. To give one example, the WTO has provision for what I call sector-specific agreements. So there's a sector-specific agreement for IT products. They're working on one for environmental goods. The advantage of this is that you don't need all WTO membership. You need a sort of a small critical mass. And once in place, it essentially creates a pathway to extend that agreement to other WTO members in a way that is not non-distortionary, because it's essentially applying MFN. We've also revisited some of the points that the Commission has made in earlier reports about examining the costs and benefits of potential agreements and doing so up front. Hurry up, yep. And I think the other point about trade agreements that gets to this concern about trade perhaps weakening the ability of governments to address environmental issues or labour standards is the nature of the way in which negotiation of trade agreements consults with the community, and we think there's room there to strengthen that consultation process. So let me quickly go through the remaining 2 slides. The second prong of the strategy is what we call the companion policies. These relate to how governments have managed the adjustment costs and to build support for reform. They're typically looking at the social safety net, education and training, job search assistance, and we don't really know how well those policies have actually worked. We know they're aiming to minimise the disruptive impact, but they're very rarely being evaluated. So at a minimum, we think that there would be interest in better understanding how those policies work. And again, these are really across all forms of shocks to the economy, not just trade. And we think that such companion policies could also be strengthened. The third prong relates to better communication. It's often been taken for granted that open markets has community acceptance, but there is a lot of public misconception about international trade, and lowering obstacles to trade is often seen as benefiting other countries, and for this reason it's often opposed, particularly if it's seen as reducing jobs in the Australian economy, which would be a sentiment that most economies, all economies I would argue, would have. But also research has shown that when people understand the implications of protectionism, they're more likely to support free trade. And in Australia, there's been limited investigation of public opinion and of the more recent consequences of freer trade for Australia. That's beginning to change. I know DFAT and Austrade are working on this. And I know also the Department of Industry has done some innovative work looking at the impacts on individual firms. So we think that's a good development, and we think that that could be reinforced. But we would caution that you need to go beyond just focusing on the positive stories and look at how adjustment is taking place in the community, and acknowledging that there will be some that will be finding it tough, and understand how then those programs that are put in place can be better targeted. And we think that together these 3 prongs of a strategy to reduce protectionist pressures will help the community to better understand what is at stake if tariffs and barriers to trade are reinstated. And we hope that today's report will be a first step in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. We just take a couple of questions now. The idea is to try and get some discussion at the end, but subject to the time taken. As Jonathan mentioned, most people in this room are probably pro-trade and are probably thinking that this is a very good report coming out. So perhaps I'll invite anybody here who thinks that is against trade or against the kind of thing to put their hand up and ask a question. Peter, you've got...
I'm slightly disingenuous. I mean, I'm against free trade and intellectual property, or in particular the agreement between the United States and Australia. So the Trump administration has said it wants to wind back many of the recent trade agreements, and so perhaps that means that the Australia-US trade agreement will be revisited. If the intellectual property provisions of that agreement were weakened or put back to the way they were before, what would be the effect on Australian welfare?
Thank you, Peter. I think you know I worked on intellectual property inquiry last year. I think the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement is one example of where an agreement has introduced binding measures that, on the intellectual property side, given Australia is a large net importer of sort of intellectual goods that embody a lot of intellectual property, itself would have been a net negative for Australia. So I agree. You can identify specific areas where there could be a potential gain, and I would say that example gets precisely to the message that we have about better understanding the costs and benefits before you enter into an agreement. I would say that listening to what Trump has said is that he would argue that US firms are being ripped off for their intellectual property, so I wouldn't hold out much hope for getting something which would shift the balance of intellectual property in Australia's favour.
Second question, preferably somebody who wants to be critical. Yes.
My question is related to the automobile manufacturing of Australia, the winding down of automobile manufacturing. How would you situate that from this perspective? Because when tariffs were higher, it flourished, and with the winding down of tariffs, it swept away from Australia. So under those evidence, how would you respond?
Well, I think you're right. It flourished under high barriers, and it stopped flourishing under lower barriers. It was a deliberate policy to establish local manufacturing. Some used the so-called infant industry argument, but that infant never grew up. And so I think it's an example of why open markets bring benefits, but are also disruptive by the way, almost by definition, it's almost tautological that trade is disruptive. That's the mechanism through which you can drive stronger competition, more innovation, and that has then consequences for those that are in the sector. Automobiles is also one of the examples where, because of the nature of the lowering of barriers, you could say that the adjustment hadn't sort of taken place 20 years ago because they were scheduled to be implemented over a period of time. So there is obviously still adjustment going on in the automobile manufacturing sector.
Thank you very much. Can we thank Jonathan very much for his presentation, and maybe we'll get some more questions at the end if we can possibly have time.
Yep.
Okay, I now welcome Simon Campbell to the podium, as it were, to talk about the productivity trends and effect of structural change. Sorry,
Went past it.
back.
Can we click on the name?
Yes, you pick on the name, I think, yes.
Oh, why isn't it there?
Let me introduce Simon.
I just started.
Simon's working at the Commonwealth Treasury,
try.
the macroeconomic group, for the last couple of years.
No.
I've got it on a USB.
Before that, he worked in Treasury's Markets Group on competition policy, Revenue Group on personal tax policy. He also worked for the Department of Education and the ABS, so has a strong pedigree in the Commonwealth Treasury.
Right. Okay, not a great
Star doesn't seem like it's on there, but can I plug a USB into there?
I have no idea. Do we have a technical support here?
Sorry,
Did you
everyone.
not load it?
My colleague loaded it on, they said it was linked, but looks like it's-
Be able to load a USB directly on, or if not, we better take Ben with us and.
plug it in, it'll be on there.
Thank you very
Right.
much. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for that slow start. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Peter. Hope everyone's still awake this late in the afternoon, but if you start nodding off, don't worry, I won't be offended. As Peter mentioned, I'm from the Macroeconomic Group in Treasury. I work in a small team that does research on medium-term macroeconomic issues like productivity, and this includes taking an industry level and increasingly a firm level perspective on what's going on at the aggregate level. So my presentation today is mainly factual, and that's despite the session being titled Medium-Term Policies for Economic Growth. I'm going to have to mainly steer clear of any detailed policy discussion because that's well above my pay grade at Treasury, but hopefully you'll find this interesting anyway and come away with some new insights into Australian productivity. The presentation is based on a forthcoming paper with my co-author Harry Withers, who's sitting down here at the front, and it'll hopefully be published soon, any day now. We've been waiting for a while, on the Treasury Research Institute website, which you can access through the Treasury website. So just to run through the structure of the presentation today, I'll start by setting the context. So why are we looking at this? Why is it important to understand our productivity performance and the drivers behind it? What are the implications for economic growth and living standards? We'll then look at the sources of productivity growth in Australia, so looking at the contribution of capital deepening and MFP, multi-factor productivity growth, to aggregate labour productivity growth over the last few decades. And we'll discuss whether the source of labour productivity growth really matters. So people often think that capital deepening led growth isn't a great way for an economy to go about it, but is that really so? We'll then look at sectoral or industry level productivity growth, including within sector productivity growth, so the productivity performance of different sectors over time, and across sector productivity growth, or what we're calling the structural change effect. And so this takes into account the relative productivity levels of different sectors and how labour moves between them. And then we'll look at the overall effect on aggregate productivity growth of these two components and their individual contribution. For the conclusion, I'll wrap up what this all means and highlight a few key takeaways from this work. For example, I'll answer whether structural change in the economy is going to hurt us in terms of lowering our measured productivity growth, or whether it's a bit of a non-issue. And I'll highlight the key sectors for Australia going forward, and at a very high level, the kind of policies that might support productivity growth. So, as you're all already aware, productivity growth is very important. It's the key determinant of growth in Australian living standards, and you might be familiar with this chart already, showing the contributions to gross national income per capita of different variables there. And Treasury likes to use this chart a lot because it really emphasises the importance of productivity growth to improving living standards. So you can see in previous years the growth in labour utilisation, which is in red, and improvements in the terms of trade, which is the green bit, particularly since the turn of the century, have supplemented labour productivity growth, which is the grey chunks there, in helping living standards to grow. So labour productivity has always been the biggest component in national per capita income growth, generally with a little help from demographics and a bit of help from the terms of trade. But as we can see in the column on the right, which projects out over the next 10 years, the expected lower terms of trade going forward and the continued ageing of the population means that labour productivity is more important than ever as a driver of future growth in living standards. So recent productivity growth is okay. At 1.8% over the last 5 years, it's in line with its longer term performance. We can't be complacent, because to achieve income growth in line with its long-term average, so for the line in the chart to follow the dotted line rather than the solid line, we would need sustained labour productivity growth of around 2.5% each year. So we'd need the dark grey chunk plus the light grey chunk. And you can see this is faster growth than any period in the past, including the golden age of the 1990s, when major reforms of the 80s and 90s had their greatest impact. So you can see it's a pretty big ask. And so that's why Treasury's research on productivity is important, because understanding the trends in Australia's productivity performance and the impact of structural change can help reveal where we currently stand and the implications for the future. So this chart just breaks down the sources of productivity growth. So labour productivity growth, shown by the black line there across productivity growth cycles as calculated by the ABS, is the sum of capital deepening, which is in blue, and that reflects greater capital per worker, and MFP growth, which is in red, reflecting the overall efficiency in how capital and labour are combined in production. And so consistent with Treasury's medium-term projection methodology, where we use a 30-year average in projecting productivity growth forwards in budgets and intergenerational report, let's look at the breakdown of labour productivity growth over the last 30 years. And I can tell you that of the 30-year average of 1.6% labour productivity growth each year, capital deepening contributed 0.9 percentage points and MFP growth 0.7 percentage points. So there's a fair bit more blue there than red, except for, again, the mid-90s when you had those major reforms and when ICT use really took off. So we generally rely more on capital deepening than MFP, but is that a problem? Well, MFP growth is often considered a better and more sustainable source of labour productivity growth than capital deepening, basically because it doesn't necessarily require an economy to forego consumption. Australia has largely avoided the downsides to capital deepening-led labour productivity growth. And that's because international productivity improvements have reduced the price of capital goods relative to consumption goods. So this has allowed a high rate of capital deepening without foregoing ever higher levels of consumption. And so the ability to import cheaper capital goods has allowed Australia to sustain this capital deepening-led labour productivity growth. A couple of other reasons why at Treasury we don't focus too heavily on MFP performance include that improvements in MFP don't really come for free, so it's not really the manna from heaven as it's often described, given it usually requires the use of other factors of production, such as land. And it's also prone to mismeasurement due to it not being directly observed. So as a residual, its measurement's affected by capital, by mismeasuring in both the inputs, and its measurement's also affected by capital investment to output lags, so particularly in mining. So in the end, policy settings that support both capital deepening, for example, by lowering the cost of capital, and MFP improvements, e.g. through greater efficiency, innovation and reallocation within existing resource constraints, will support future growth in labour productivity. And we shouldn't really be overly worried about where exactly the labour productivity growth comes from. So the drivers of aggregate labour productivity growth can be better understood by looking at it from a sectoral or an industry perspective. And this provides insights into the role that structural change plays in aggregate productivity growth. And in the analysis that follows, we disaggregate the economy into 6 sectors. So agriculture, forestry and fishing, mining, manufacturing, utilities, construction, and then services, where services is simply the aggregate of the remaining sectors in the economy. Now, of course, productivity performance could vary greatly across different services sectors, but we've just combined them mainly for simplicity and to demonstrate the size and importance of all the services sectors. And we may look to split them up in the future. So for each of these sectors and for the aggregate, we can decompose labour productivity growth into the within-sector contribution and the across-sector contribution. So the formula here, we have Y is aggregate GDP, YI is sectoral value added, N is aggregate hours worked, and NI is sectoral total hours. And so the first term, the within industry effect, is the weighted sum of labour productivity growth within individual sectors, where weights are the share of output of each sector at the beginning of the time period. And in the second term, the across industry or structural change effect is the weighted sum of the changes in sectoral employment shares, where the weights are relative productivity levels at the beginning of the time period. So in the absence of workers moving between sectors, so if we didn't have the second term in the formula on the last chart, it's the productivity growth within sectors that determines growth in aggregate labour productivity. And this chart shows how labour productivity has grown in different sectors, indexed to 100 in 88-89, which is the earliest we can go back to for this analysis. And we can see that labour productivity has grown strongly in agriculture, which is the blue line, with productivity in the sector now over 2.5 times its 88-89 level. And mining, which is red, and utilities in green, showed strong labour productivity growth until the early 2000s before steadily declining through to 2011-12. And in fact, mining sector productivity has fallen so far over that period that in 2011-12 it was below its 88-89 levels. But with the shift of the mining boom to the production phase, mining sector labour productivity growth has improved recently, as you can see by the red line kicking back up. So for example, in 2014-15, labour productivity in mining grew by around 30% in that single year alone. And despite mining's productivity growth levelling off a little since, we expect it to continue its recovery in coming years as output increases. In other sectors, productivity in manufacturing, which is in grey, and construction in purple, have grown in line with the broader economy. And as has labour productivity in services, which is in orange, which is not surprising given they account for almost 70% of Australia's economic output, as we can see in the next chart. So here we have shares of output, and the colours of each sector are the same as the previous chart. And note though that services are plotted on the right-hand side axis while the other sectors are on the left. And this chart shows that despite the attention given to mining, it's the services sectors that will continue to play a key role in driving future aggregate productivity growth. And of course, mining's share of output is certainly significant, and now at over 8% of the economy, rising sharply from just over 5.5% in 2003-04. But over the last 5 years, over half of Australia's annual aggregate labour productivity growth was attributable to growth within the services sectors, compared with around 1/4 attributable to mining. So this underlines the importance of policy settings in the services sectors. Meanwhile, manufacturing and agriculture, often referred to as key drivers of Australia's productivity, continue to shrink. So the two industries now contribute less than 10% of Australia's output combined, around 7% and 2.5% respectively. And so this means their contribution to aggregate productivity growth over the last 5 years has been negligible. So for example, even if agriculture has rapid productivity growth, it really doesn't make much difference from an aggregate sense because it's now such a small part of the economy. And it doesn't mean it's not an important industry for other reasons, but from a macroeconomic perspective, it's not really a key sector here. So now we look at productivity levels by sector, and that's dollars per hour worked. And this is relevant for the second term in our equation, the across sector, or the structural change component of aggregate productivity growth. And the lines here are productivity levels of each sector as a ratio to the economy-wide average. So for example, a ratio of 3 means the sector produces 3 times more output per hour worked than the economy as a whole. And now when we talk about structural change, in this context we mean the shift of labour in the sense of the share of total hours worked from one industry to another. And so as labour shifts in this way, the contribution to aggregate productivity growth would depend on the relative productivity between sectors. So labour moving from relatively high productivity sectors to relatively low productivity sectors will detract from aggregate productivity growth and vice versa. And the key sector here is mining, again shown in red. And you can see that although the level of productivity in the mining sector over recent decades has been up and down, it's remained the highest in the economy. And so only the productivity levels of utilities, which is in green again, have come close. So productivity in mining is now over 3 times the economy-wide average, after peaking at almost 6 times the economy-wide average in 2000. So structural change will only really have a significant effect on aggregate labour productivity growth when labour moves in and out of the mining sector, and to a much smaller extent the utilities sector. As the chart shows, there would be little gain or cost to aggregate labour productivity growth when labour moves between sectors with similar productivity levels, such as manufacturing, construction and services, or with relative productivity ratios around 1. It's really only of significance when labour moves between these sectors and mining, and in reality we can kind of ignore utilities as its labour share has been pretty constant. So this chart shows how each sector's share of hours worked has changed, and it highlights the movement of labour across different sectors. And again, services is plotted on the right-hand side. And now in some sectors, as you might expect, there has been an inverse relationship between productivity growth and the labour share. So the strong labour productivity growth in agriculture over recent decades, shown earlier, is explained by reduced hours worked in the sector, shown by the steadily declining blue line here, for the production of broadly the same output. And we see the same inverse relationship in the mining sector, which has a big impact on aggregate productivity growth. So the decline in the share of hours worked in mining from 88-89 to the early 2000s is associated with rising productivity levels shown in earlier charts. And this inverse relationship then continued in the other direction as the mining boom attracted labour while production fell sharply due to a combination of a significant increase in labour with a modest increase in output. And we can see this is beginning to turn around again lately. And so as I'll show, it's these movements of labour into and out of mining that have been driving the fluctuations in both the within and across sector contributions to aggregate labour productivity growth. So just to tie it all together, we can now chart aggregate productivity growth, which is the black line, decomposed into within and across sector contributions. So we have the sum of all the sectors within sector productivity growth in blue and the overall effect of structural change in red. And we can see that the productivity growth is largely driven by the within sector contribution. So the blue dominates the red here. And in fact, just over 90% of the economy's aggregate labour productivity growth has come from within sector productivity growth. Also interesting in this chart is that it illustrates distinct periods where structural change, so the red, has detracted from aggregate productivity growth and where it has contributed to it, broken up here by the dotted lines. And this is mainly because the red bars are closely associated with movements of labour into and out of mining. So for example, when mining's share of hours worked falls, such as during the period from the early 90s up until the turn of the century, we see large blue bars representing strong within sector productivity growth, largely driven by mining's productivity performance, and smaller negative red bars, which is the offsetting effect on aggregate labour productivity growth of losing labour to less productive sectors. And when the mining sector's share of hours worked rise, such as from the early 2000s until recently, we see smaller blue bars combining with positive red bars, as reduced productivity growth within mining is supplemented by the positive effect of the sector attracting labour from lower productivity sectors like agriculture and manufacturing. So this chart is basically the same as the previous one, but it separates the years where movements of labour detract from aggregate productivity growth and where they add to it. And that shows the first 2 columns there. So for example, in the first column, this is the sum of all the years in the previous chart where the red bars were negative, and the second column is the sum of years where the red bars are positive. And the chart also separates the contribution to aggregate labour productivity growth of the mining and services sectors. Mining is in dark blue and services is in that middle kind of colour shade of blue. And the 2 most recent years are also shown separately as a useful comparison. Now the key feature of the chart is that when labour movements have detracted from aggregate productivity growth, so in the first and the third columns, aggregate productivity growth in those years, which is the black diamond marker, has been higher than the years where labour movements have made a positive contribution, which is the second and fourth columns. And this means essentially that the within sector effect from mining when labour leaves the sector dominates the across sector effect. And this is because workers typically move from higher to lower productivity sectors, such as from mining to services, when output in the former is growing rapidly. So the net effect to aggregate labour productivity growth is positive. And when labour moves towards mining, within sector productivity growth in mining is significantly weaker or even negative, generally because labour is attracted to mining during a construction boom when output's yet to fully come online. And the chart also highlights the significant role that services have played in underpinning productivity over almost three decades. So those middle blue chunks in the first 2 columns are quite sizable. And going forward, we expect the medium term to look more like the first and the third columns, with quite strong aggregate labour productivity growth, driven by more mining output coming online as the sector continues to shed its unneeded labour. And this is despite a slight return of labour to mining very recently to take advantage of temporary spikes in resource prices, which could lead to more columns like the fourth column in the very short term. But even so, in 2015-16, when mining added a little bit of labour, it still contributed around a quarter of the economy's aggregate labour productivity growth. Yep, that's one. So, what key messages should you take away from today? Well, despite concerns about Australia's labour productivity and MFP growth, recent labour productivity growth driven by capital deepening is in line with its longer-term averages. So 1.8% over the past 5 years versus 1.6% for the past 30 years. And we shouldn't be too worried about the effect of structural change on productivity growth. While services continue to attract more and more labour, the aggregate productivity level is similar to all other sectors in the economy, bar mining and utilities, and they're combined with in-sector growth. Productivity growth is tracking at similar speeds to the whole economy. So it's services that have and will underpin productivity growth in Australia, notwithstanding cyclical periods of weak and strong productivity growth in mining. Mining has peaks and troughs, but workers generally leave mining for lower productivity sectors when mining's doing well, so the net effect to productivity is positive. So while mining's expected to continue to make a strong contribution to productivity growth the next few years, the services sectors will remain responsible for growth prospects in the longer term. And within sector productivity growth driving the aggregate story, it's both capital deepening and MFP improvements that are important to supporting future growth in labour productivity. And so that means any policies that support either more capital or the more efficient use of capital and labour are welcome in boosting our living standards. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Any questions? Yes.
Greg Conley from the Department of Employment. One problem with doing sort of sectoral... Greg Conley from the Department of Employment, Simon. One problem with doing the sectoral analysis that you've done with standard ABS data is that you've got output from the business surveys and hours worked, your denominator, from the labour force survey. But the employment figures, especially by industry, don't match between the labour force survey and the business survey. I've written a paper on it that I'm hoping to get up on my department's website soon, but the ABS is addressing it through setting up a set of labour accounts. So are you going to redo your analysis after the ABS releases its labour accounts?
Yeah, so thanks, Greg. I think we might have discussed this week before. Yeah. So I've seen some of that work that the ABS has done, which looks quite interesting, and it's definitely something I think we'll explore. I think, it'd be interesting to see how it kind of comes out. I think the overall effect of the labour accounts kind of evens out once they kind of adjust for all the sectors. But in this kind of exercise, it'd be interesting to see kind of how it changes the story. I think, for particularly between like mining and construction, you have some issues with labour being misclassified based on the surveys. So definitely, I think when they release that, we'll try and rerun this. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you have any views
Can you
on...
just give a name and...
Hi, I'm Suchita. I'm from the Treasury as well. I was just wondering if you have any views on whether this kind of story has anything to do with the wages kind of issue, where there's a stagnation in wages and
No wage growth.
yeah, and what do you think? Do you think there's any kind of implications from this?
So the wages one's a tricky one. I think that's something we're all trying to kind of understand. I think over the long term, we would still say that there should be a pretty close link between labour productivity growth and wages. But the terms of trade, the increase in the terms of trade kind of in the early part of this century kind of made that link lose some of that link. So we're trying to kind of investigate what's going on with the Treasury's more broadly trying to investigate what's going on with wages. I think a lot of organisations and people are. It may have more to do with other factors like underemployment or other labour market issues rather than productivity. But I think they're more short-term issues, and over the longer term, I think we'd still say wages should follow productivity growth fairly closely.
That's a very optimistic view. There's a question there.
James Giesiker from Centre of Policy Studies. I have two questions. The first is in the forward projection of, I think it was per capita consumption or GNP, had a negative contribution from the terms of trade, which implied, I think, a forecast of further decline from the current levels of the terms of trade. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that as a reasonable forecast going forward. The second is a technical question. As I understand it, from the beginning of your presentation, you suggested that Treasury bases its GDP forecasts in part on a forecast of labour productivity. And then in the end of the presentation, you spoke to forecasting MFP growth, but in particular your forecast of labour productivity growth. And that labour productivity growth arising from further capital deepening. Now that capital deepening, a rise in the capital labour ratio, must come from either technical bias in technical change towards capital, or a forward projection of declining real cost of capital relative to the real wage. And I wonder whether you go further in your forecasting. Having forecast implicit capital deepening, do you then interrogate those forecasts for what the implicit bias in technical change is and what the implicit fall in the real cost of capital is going forward?
So just to be clear, we don't really forecast productivity growth. We have a projection that gets used kind of in the medium term projections in things like the IGR and the longer term budget numbers, which is based on looking back over the last 30 years of labour productivity growth and just kind of assuming that we project that same growth forward. So it's not it's not very technical, and we don't make any, as far as I know, we don't make any judgments as to whether the capital deepening and MFP kind of split will stay the same or whether that will change. We just kind of look at labour productivity. But I mean, I personally don't work in that area that forecasts those budget projections, so I'm sorry I can't answer that in any more detail. Similarly with the terms of trade issue, it's not my exact area, but my understanding is that while the terms of trade have come up a bit lately, I think over the longer term, I think we're assuming that's fairly temporary, and over the longer term they're still going to be significantly lower, and that's going to drag on per capita income.
We could talk about this for another half an hour.
Thanks,
we could
Harry.
talk about the trade projections and free trade things for another half hour. In fact, as the third speaker, we must move on to the labour and labour issues and the role of immigration on local wages and on the economy. There's clearly an absolute fundamental point about the global forces driving our economy. So I've introduced Glenn Withers. And I actually first want to thank Simon Campbell. Thank you very much for Glenn, as many of you know, is Professor of Economics at the ANU and also UNSW Canberra. Doesn't seem to be a conflict of interest. He's also President of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. Previously, he was founding CEO of Universities Australia and Professor of Public Policy at ANU and at ANZOG. So please welcome Glenn to talk about labour, immigration and real wages. Thanks, Glenn. If there are time at the end, we'll certainly have more questions, but I'm conscious we may or may not. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Peter. This is the fate of being at the end of the queue. We Withers know about these things. I indicated in an earlier session. I was the kid at the end of the queue when they were handing out the school milk, and they either ran out of milk or it got hot in the sun and curdled. So it's one of the remaining major forms of discrimination in our society is alphabeticism that needs to be addressed, and I wish government would pay attention to the inequities of this system. I was asked to talk about human capital in the Australian future, and essentially there's two components to that, of course, domestic skills and immigrant skills. I'm going to put my emphasis, as it were, putting on a Universities Australia type hat to focus actually most on education and training more than immigration, because to do both in the time available will be pretty tough. But I'll try and indicate their complementarity, which is certainly there. But first of all, because I'm also by training an economic historian, so can I give a little bit of context to begin with? Why worry? You know, Australia's a damn good situation compared to the rest of the world. According to Credit Suisse, we're the world's wealthiest country per capita. According to the UN, we're the top of the Human Development Index. And of course the OECD and everyone else acknowledges the longest growth phase of any industrial country. So what's the problem? Why have we got an issue? What's the difficulty? Are we just whingers who just keep wanting more? And this is not enough. If you look at, I love this chart, it's a bit old now, but it's from Ed Lima. He did a piece in the American Economic Review where he looked at the gravity models of distance and impact upon GDP per capita, or per capita income actually. And what he's got is the four countries of Australia, Singapore, New Zealand and Taiwan at the time were the ones that transcended the problems of being distant from their markets. And that to us shows that not only were we lucky, as in the sense of the Donald Horne debates, but we deserved it. We must have done something to punch above our weight and do things well and right, and therefore policy's okay, and we're just a little bit antsy when we needn't be. Well, is that the case? Well, I'd like to go a bit further back to talk about economic history, and not to include the 30,000 years of indigenous history, but at least post arrival of the Europeans. And essentially, for those who have never taken an economic history course, because it's very rare these days in a university to do an economic history course, it's almost as rare as doing economics in your commerce degrees these days. But economic history is sort of long gone, but you can catch up pretty quickly. Post-European Australian economic history is just four phases: a pause period, a boom, a bunch of problems for a pause where you have war and depression, and then a boom again. And that's it. That's Australia's history for 227 years or so. It looks like this. That's the convict period to begin with, settlement, a little bit of pastoral settlement, but then you have gold rushes, big population increases, and a long boom that builds Marvellous Melbourne and the exhibition hall and all these sorts of things, exhibition building. And then you have a period of depression, war, and then after the Second World War you have another long boom, and indeed this is the longest boom of all. It has two long booms in it if you actually decompose it. There's a long period which you can call the Menzies boom, then there's a bunch of trouble, and then there's a long period you can call the Hawke, Keating, Howard, Costello boom if you want to. And the question... Yes, absolutely. And the question now is, where are we at? Have we got to worry? Are we at a turning point? Well, one reason you might want to worry is when you look at when in the post-war period, just decompose the post-war period now and forget about the real 200 plus years. In the last 50 or 60 years, what you've got is the period where the Menzies long boom finished in a period of political chaos. The political chaos then had the name of Holt, McEwen, McMahon and Gorton, where they all fought for, inside the Liberal Party, for ongoing control of the Liberal Party. Ushered in the end of that Menzies long boom for a while, a little period of pause and chaos within the post-war long boom. So now, since then, we've had our 26, 27 years of growth, just as Menzies delivered 26, 27 years of growth. And indeed, even the 19th century long boom was about 26 or 27 years. Now, does therefore Rudd, Gillard, Abbott, Turnbull, etc. mean the end of that phase of growth? And therefore, for political reasons of the structures and guidances and frameworks of the country, we should be worrying and not just being complacent about being at the top of the world wealth and happiness and livability indexes, etc., that really our underlying unease does have a basis. And indeed, if you go back to structures rather than the superficial politics of bubbling away at the surface of the world, our our reform one-offs of the micro-reform era, the Hawke, Keating, etc. era, has depleted. They typically restructure, if you believe the Mansell Olson sort of propositions, they shake things up, you find better ways of doing things, and then you settle down again and the payoffs are depleted. The mining investment boom has plateaued, so that it's no longer an investment boom but a mineral sales sustained export. And we've got the big problem of inequality that's emerged over this period. And as a result, because of these sorts of structural developments, as well as some political carrying on, we've got a big shift in attitudes, it seems. We do worry about the future, much more than we might want to on the basis, if you just looked at global benchmarks, we do very nicely, thank you. So what's needed? I have an argument that we can indeed sustain this boom or retain the boom, that is restore sustained growth, go beyond the 26 or 27 years, and there's two things that are needed. There's a bunch of incomplete structural reform that we can still readily define, and this is what business is always on about and fights with the Prime Minister at dinners and says, you know, we need more company tax cuts and we need more industrial relations reform and so on. Equally, that whenever you talk to a Labor Party or Green people, there's an agenda beloved of progressives that largely focuses on investment in national capability. If you like to think about it, the first lot deliver competition. The second lot delivers the capability to compete, the capacity to compete. And that's investment in infrastructure, investment in education, investment in innovation and so on. And indeed, there's an interesting sort of thought, which is what if we actually walked on two legs rather than one and had both more competition reform and investment in the capability to compete? In that case, we'd actually be a rather mature society. And indeed, if you model what that might look like, to give you the answer, our standard of living consumption per capita would rise by 22% or more by 2030. Now, how do we get that? The answer in this case was Chris Murphy's independent economics modelling, in which he modelled two sets of reforms, the structural reforms, and what we did in this modelling, because I worked on this with Chris, we looked at all the sort of reports on what Australia should do, what it would achieve, what reform would deliver, and we looked at the ones that gave specific policy reform that you could model and gave bases for the parameter estimates of the impact of the reform to put into the model. So you look at something like Ken Henry's tax reform report, you look at something like the Productivity Commission on regulation reform, you look at the Productivity Commission on privatisation and contracting out, you go to the Centre for International Economics on the Free Trade Agreement improvements, and so on. Ian Harper's Competition Policy Review, an excellent piece of work by Toomey and Withers on federalism reform and industrial relations reform, and you take their estimates of what you can put as inputs of reform, and most of them are pretty conservative, and they're all based on their own modelling. It's not just, you know, lick your fingers and put it in the air and see what it is. If you're doing that, you're putting your finger in the model and getting results that are justifiable by close examination. If you just did the structural reforms, the Murphy model comes out with about an 11% increase in per capita standard of living for an outcome from continuing, if you like, the business agenda. On the other hand, if you want to be a progressive and help the Greens recover from the problems they've got, you can go through investment reform. You can improve labour force participation by increasing women's participation, especially in the workforce, and older workers too. You can increase infrastructure sensibly by implementing the Infrastructure Australia list of good projects, attested projects, properly examined projects. You can follow the sorts of recommendations that uninterested, non-selfish bodies like the Universities of Australia, TAFE directors and ACPET put forward as education enhancement. It happens to be they've done some really good modelling each that they've commissioned, and they actually converge pretty well by three different modellers. Now, there can be other explanations of that, but I can assure you it wasn't a conspiracy, but just modellers serving the interests of their entities in reasonably documented and defensible ways. And you can look at research and innovation enhancement and immigration enhancement through the modelling of the Migration Council of Australia. It so happens that modelling those alone and not doing any competition policy improvements, structural improvements, again, you get about an 11% increase in your standard of living by about 2030. Now, why not do both? You know, if you want to be Malcolm in the middle, why not be both a progressive and a business fan, and use the blending of these reforms so that everybody's a winner, in the sense of you've befuddled every loser who wants to fight against individual changes, because there are so many changes they don't know what's going on, which is that part of the Hawke and Keating trick of micro-reform, you know, peas and thimbles everywhere, and out of it you really didn't know what your outcomes were, and people went along with it. They were persuaded the country had reached a situation where we needed to do this. So, how to get to the point? Let's look at the progressive reform and assume, dare I say it, to help blend and walk on two legs, to say that we're all capitalists now. That is, we believe in the importance of physical capital, we believe in the importance of social capital, we believe in the importance of institutional capital, and we believe in the importance of natural capital. We focus on all these, but we also, of course, focus on human and knowledge capital. And it was the human capital that particularly, of course, started so much focus in modern times on capital as a force for growth through the work of Becker and people like that. I want to focus now on, let's show how we can take forward walking on two legs by particularly what we might do in an area like human capital. The modelling took some pre-existing stuff from the lobby groups that was properly modelled, documented, transparent, attested, refereed, etc. But now let's look what might be behind it, how it would work, why it works. This is the Murphy modelling. In summary, before I get into the human capital behind it, the 22% rise in living standards by 2030 would come from about an 8% contribution from the employment rate, an 8.4% of the 22 coming from labour productivity, and an increased consumption share, given this living standards measure that he uses as the best measure of benefits to Australian residents of the outcomes. So we're particularly going to focus on what of those components we can get. It comes pretty close to saying what are we doing in this country about Treasury's 3 Ps, population, productivity and participation. One thing that studies around this have shown that I've been involved in particular, Australian Council of Learned Academies study, and the references at the end, or you can get it at the on the website for ACOLA. ACOLA is the acronym for Australian Council of Learned Academies, a bold and brave and a difficult experiment where the different disciplines across science and technology and social science and humanities are actually trying to work together. Every time in the past it's failed, but currently we're actually cooperating well because we're responding to the sting from people like Peter Shergold and Michael Keating and Martin Parkinson and Ian Watt as well, who when they step down from office typically do a speech somewhere to an academic audience and say how universities have failed them because they give disciplinary answers rather than holistic answers, and public servants need and government needs the disciplines to come together on the big existential challenges of the time, like population ageing or climate change or whatever. I'm not quite sure what public servants are meant to be doing in this role if they just receive these things as integrated outcomes. I thought they were the integrators, but anyway, we in the Academy are responding to this demand rather than evaluate it and trying to pull it together to get different disciplines to cooperate in a multidisciplinary manner. And in this case, we went off and did surveys of the interest groups to find out what they thought of what was needed. And we found that as well as understanding the need for these policy changes to get them and make them work well, everyone from members of CEDA to members of ACOS to members of IPA, who all got surveyed for this, the public administration body too, said, hey, to make this work we need leadership and partnership. That is, we've got into too combative an era, too antagonistic an era, and we're not being led to know what is good policy. And indeed, we even went out and said to the public, if people got together and did this at our leader level, across not just government, but across business, across the union movement, across the community sector, and so on, would you be willing to support initiatives that cost more money? And what was really quite interesting was that more than half indicated, and this is fairly rigorous contingent valuation stuff where you're testing people with budgets and so on. You're not just saying, hey, would you like some more of this, but you don't have to pay for it. This is making them having to affirm they'd be willing to pay, and this is what they already pay, and this is what it now would be, and so on. About half would be willing to pay at least a little more in overall tax to support reform. Indeed, the average for the National Population Survey was about $1,000 a head of taxpayers who said they would be willing to do this to support this vision of Australia of walking on two legs. And indeed, they'd be very happy for it to be through an increase in GST rather than reductions in company taxes and income tax. So they see through the tax veil. And then we try to work out which ones they would most want. And there's a sort of assumption that education at tertiary level is not quite so popular, but as Benjamin Franklin certainly recognised a long time ago, investment in knowledge pays the best interest. Once we gave them some information about the rates of return to different types of investments, we began to find a real shift in attitude towards where the investments can and should be. And here's an example of the sort of information we did in focus group work. This is a bunch of modelling studies, publicly produced modelling studies in every case, that you could begin to look at rates of return. Now this is only, in this case, is not rates of return as it's GDP increase, but what we looked at were everything from the modelling done for the Australia-Indonesia Free Trade Agreement, wonderful outcome of 0.02% of GDP, all the way through to the Bradley higher education reforms, which were 6.1% of GDP long-term outcomes from those reforms. And people began to start talking in these focus groups about things like what the Henry Tax Review meant, why would it pay off in big time compared to free trade agreements, which often have negatives rather than positives, and so on. So there's that problem of the implementation of bilateral free trade agreements in particular, as we've been hinting at a little in our discussions earlier. But human capital came through very strongly as a very big return, and everyone understands the reasons why. Here's what happens with fertility as year 12 retention rates have gone up in Australia. We have smaller families, and as Becker would have predicted, we invest a lot more in the smaller number of kids in families. So those kids get a really good set up for life. What's happened there? We increase the participation rate substantially as we increase education levels and reduce fertility. We could go further. This is Australia's female labour participation rate for 15 to 64 across countries that are fairly comparable with us. Australia is the little blue block compared to countries like New Zealand, Canada or Sweden. So that there's a long way we can still go on female participation, and education is a key driver of that, and it's going in the right direction, but it hasn't paid off fully yet because some of the structural reforms still need to be done too, with respect to childcare provision especially is the Swedish key to why it does so well in this respect. So if you're worried about the expenditure on childcare, the huge payoff in terms of your labour force participation and hence your tax revenues from working families is out there just waiting to be tapped. And as everyone knows, this is the standard sort of payoff to investment in education. The VET one looks low. This is age earnings profiles. Compared to the no further qualifications blue or aqua line at the bottom, going into a VET qualification helps over your life in getting more. Going to university pays off even more in your lifetime income. And the standard lobbying line we use with politicians in universities is you get 1.5 million more over your lifespan from your university education compared to a school leaver with no further qualifications. And the politicians go, oh, that sounds good because 1.5 million comes in over your lifespan, third of that comes back in taxes. That really helps with fiscal consolidation, doesn't it? And then if you mention about being the third best export earner in the world and stop talking about knowledge, truth, justice and social criticism, then they start really paying attention and are very impressed by the economisation. Yes, thanks, Peter. But turn this into rates of return, and actually VET is producing a better rate of return than higher ed universities, I can now say openly, the costs of that vet education and the early employment rates, when you're discounting this stuff, are very high in vocational education and training. And as we know, since these sorts of census data were produced in the previous census, we've absolutely decimated proper vet education in terms of its quality and support and resourcing, and without much proper improvement. We've lurched from one side to another in Victoria and back again, and mucked up various experiments in South Australia, and underinvested because of the Commonwealth state issues over vet and so forth. But it's one area where you could massively, it already has a still high rate of return, and you could massively sustain and enhance that rate of return. But instead we're Gonskiing along as our principal focus, without actually changing the way we deliver education much under Gonski at schooling. Likewise, early childhood gets neglected as a fantastic area for high rates of return. This is some study that I did with trying to do Dowrick sort of models of the payoff for doing aggregate analysis rather than individual analysis. And this was, we took a guy called Tom Nguyen and Steve Dowrick produced an AER paper on payoffs to education at aggregate levels, and trying to position Australia where it's at. And Australia did punch above the line of the relationship between GDP per capita and tertiary expenditure, but we still didn't do nearly as well as the countries like the Norways and Finlands and so on. And so the implication I draw from this is there's still more we can do on expenditure per capita, and there's more we can do on efficiency per capita to get education to pay off in tertiary education. That's the regression equation we used. And we found in turn that the public was willing to support this. This is one of those, part of that contingent valuation sort of stuff, willingness to pay. And they were prioritising universities and schools and TAFE, and wanted cuts in social welfare, not for pensioners, not for old age pensioners, but the unemployed and single mums and so on, the general public was not terribly supportive of. And they hated industry assistance. They do not like subsidies to Adani out there. And so there's some gerrymander electoral issues there, but the general public doesn't like it. And it doesn't get spoken about much, surprisingly, by our politicians. Okay, there's other ways we could go forward, and I did some analysis with Bruce Chapman and Tim Higgins on trying to improve innovation as well as education and link it to education and loans and so on. But in the end, it says to me, and if we had time to go through the detailed analyses that underpin all this, yes, we can indeed overcome the 26-year hoodoo. We can go forward strongly with a sustained continuing growth of our economy and per capita incomes. And indeed, we can deliver on a triple bottom line, not just the economy, which was the question asked. And immigration can play a crucial role here too, and immigration is the dollar bills on the pavement compared to other international globalisation. That you've seen those models of if you freed up all people movements around the world, you could double global GDP, and compared to trade and investment movements, which is the usual focus, if you free up border movements, you get much bigger increases. And there's some problems, and dare I say it, the way PC does this using CGE models. One of the interesting things about the Murphy modelling was it's semi-endogenous on the European pattern, whereas the PC typically does neoclassical models, which are fine for trade stuff and so on, but they're not so good for human capital analysis because they miss the endogeneities and scale economies in a number of these areas. And I've had these debates with Judy Sloan and Jonathan Pincus a lot. I think I'm turning them around, but Judy keeps relapsing and Jonathan's been converted. So I think we can get the bottom line. And why I think it's a win-win bottom line is that if you particularly focus on this investment in capability, you're actually focusing on the capacity to deal with our societal inequality issues and our environmental issues, and we don't have any time for this, but it's the last two slides. I did some analysis of the Piketty sort of stuff, and yes, there's a big increase that's levelled off a bit now for the top, 1%, 5% compared to median earnings and so on. And a bigger problem, though, is a whole lot of environmental indicators. Some go up with prosperity, some go down with prosperity, and we seem to be focusing on some of the wrong ones. So this is a Paul Burke issue for you to solve, Paul, of the Kuznets curve as to how you get environmental outcomes to be better linked to more affluent economic outcomes. And I think that's the one we've been least able to deal with. The social one, it's a matter of the will. We've got the mechanisms in our tax transfer system if we wish to. In environment, we still haven't got the mechanisms, and as we can see, that's part of a mess in our parliament. But I think the solutions are out there. We sort of know how to pull it together, but it needs leadership, the leading social groups and politicians getting together and walking on two legs for this country. So that was my contribution. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much, Ben. I'm happy to actually take questions to any speaker at this stage, obviously particularly to Glenn, but if you've got one that you'd like to go back to Jonathan or Simon, there's something we've got through the process, please do. Two or three questions. No questions at all.
Who wants to go?
They want to drink.
Yes.
Greg Connolly from the Department of Employment. And
Speak up.
Greg Connolly from the Department of Employment, and it's to Jonathan. And that's in your slides. You had something about purchasing power brackets GNA. So what's GNA, and how did you measure it?
I believe GNA refers to gross national absorption. Yep. And how it's measured, I couldn't give you specific details. In combination with this report, there is a technical report that will be, or is already up on the website, and it goes through what we've done in detail, including the link between the global contagion scenario and the implications for household incomes, and also with respect to at least physical capital, picking up one of the points that Glenn made at the end of his presentation.
Any other questions for any speaker at all? Yes.
Hi, Glenn. I'm Suchita. I was just wondering if you've had any political parties approach you and try and help you draft some policy.
Who was that? Oh, okay. Very happily so. That is, in my case, I'm non-party partisan, so I've been very happy to work with everyone from Jeff Kennett and Nick Greiner in the Reform era to Paul Keating and Bob Hawke. Most recently, though, not so much. I did have a big, long talk with Tony Abbott 2 weeks ago, which was interesting. So, I think to make a broader point, academics are going to have to increasingly get engaged for impact purposes. The incentive structure is now clearly going to be moving through government to allow not just financial incentives to universities for excellence in research publication in global journals, but to complement, I hope, and not replace, but to complement that with options to weight in proper engagement and impact metrics as well, so that universities will be encouraged more to meet the Shergold Watt type critique. By indeed trying to step outside the ivory tower. Some of us, I want a bunch of people in there protected. I love the crazies. They're fantastic. Sort of wild hair and eyes looking up the wall as they walk down the corridors, with thongs and shorts and stuff. That's fantastic in a university. The Paul Burkes are great. But equally, you've got to have a whole bunch who are convincing the world that what we're doing is, in their lifetime, meaningful and not 100 years later. And I think the government is moving towards, and on bipartisan way, a better balance in doing that.
There's a view that universities aren't very accountable for output, and I don't know how you get over that.
The accountability needs to be there, but so do the incentives. I think the incentives would deliver without having to use accountability to drive behaviour, rather use incentives to drive behaviour. Most economists would think a price mechanism rather than a regulatory mechanism is perhaps the best way forward. But yeah, you've got to get the metrics right.
I guess, just can I ask you one more thing? Do you think that's best through the political scene, through citizen engagement, or through the bureaucracy itself? Like, what's the best way to do that?
All of the above is one answer. One of the great secrets, I think, or not secrets, one of the explanations for the success of the micro-reform period of Hawke, Keating, Howard, Costello was indeed a process of partnership between all components of society, so that business leaders actually constructively engage with officials who constructively engage with community sector folk and shared evidence-based knowledge to the point where they could agree on a whole bunch of facts and then knew what they disagreed on, rather than just take an oppositional view without even going through any evidence. And this is where universities in particular can come back and contribute more, and researchers more, because the public services capacity, Productivity Commission aside, has been reduced in its internal capacity to generate this. Universities have massified, there's lots of academics out there, incentivate them more to contribute the logic and evidence, transparent, balanced, independent, and not just, I hate to say it, not just consultancies with other objectives added into their objective function.
Any final questions? Sorry. Yes, please go. Final question, yes.
My question's to Jonathan. So I'm Omar Majid from Department of Industry. So two questions. So one is, your modelling showed a scenario where China and US and are all locked in protectionist regime. What happens if something similar to what G20 showed, so where some countries become protectionist, but China, Germany openly lead the way of an open economy, so it's a bipolar world. I'm wondering what your views are on that. The second question was, you mentioned that global value chains are very, very important. So in Australia, they're not a large number, and what's your take on global value chains in Australia?
Okay, I'll take the second one first. The main reason I think that global value chains in Australia are not as prominent as they are in other economies is the nature of our exports, essentially commodities, whether they're mining commodities or primary commodities. Although there are elements of supply chain in there with steel, iron ore and steel, for example. On the first question, that is directly related to the set of scenarios we looked at using RCEP as the specific example where a group of countries sort of work together to maintain and pursue further liberalisation. We've chosen RCEP for illustrative purposes. The point is that you can, through that mechanism, illustrate that the downsides from pursuing a path of protectionism can be largely or more than largely offset. And the bigger, obviously, the greater those effects are.
Thank you, everybody. We certainly look forward to seeing the PC report that's now come out, and Simon's paper, which is going to come out shortly. And this is clearly an absolutely ongoing issue, this whole issue of what drives the economy, but what kind of problems also arise from it, which we'll be discussing a bit more tomorrow. So thank you very much to Jonathan, Simon and Glenn for coming along and talking to us.